the day Ada Atwood rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882. The wind was blowing so hard off the prairie that it nearly stripped the hat from her head, and Patrick Atkins, leaning against the post of the livery stable with his arms crossed and his jaw set like carved stone, watched her wrestle with the brim of her bonnet without offering a single word of help, which was, as everyone in Caldwell would have told her had she thought to ask, entirely typical of him. She did not know that yet. She did not know anything about Patrick Atkins, except that he ran the livery stable on the east end of Caldwell's Main Street, that his name had been written in the letter from her employer, a widow named Mrs. Doris Fenn, who ran the boarding house 3 buildings down, and that he was supposed to arrange for her trunk to be brought from the stage depot to the boarding house. She had traveled 4 days from St. Louis, and every bone in her body ached with the kind of weariness that settles into a person like dust into floorboards, deep and persistent, and not easily shaken out. She climbed down from the stage without waiting for the driver to offer his hand, which he had forgotten to do anyway, and she landed in the dirt street with both feet and steadied herself against the wheel of the coach. The wind hit her again, full in the face, carrying the smell of horses and dust, and something faintly sweet from the prairie grass beyond the edge of town. She looked around at Caldwell with the careful eyes of a woman who had learned to assess situations quickly, which was a skill she had developed out of necessity rather than inclination, and she decided it was a rougher town than she had hoped but a prettier landscape than she had expected. The man at the livery post had not moved. He was watching her with an expression that was not unfriendly exactly, but was certainly not warm. It was the expression of a man who had long ago decided that people were more trouble than they were worth, and had structured his life accordingly. Ada walked toward him because he was the only person on the street who appeared to be waiting for something, and she had been told someone would be expecting her. "I am looking for Patrick Atkins," she said, stopping a few feet in front of him. "I was told he could arrange for my trunk." He looked at her for a moment longer than was polite. He was perhaps 30 years old, lean and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water in summer, a kind of green-gray that changed depending on the light. There was a scar along his jaw that had healed pale and thin, barely visible beneath 2 or 3 days of stubble. He was wearing a plain work shirt and canvas trousers and boots that had seen considerable mileage, and he held himself with the kind of stillness that either meant a man was at peace or had simply run out of anything worth reaching for. "That is me," he said. His voice was low and even, not unpleasant in itself, but stripped of any invitation. It was the voice of a man answering a question put to him by a stranger, nothing more. "Ada Atwood," she said, and held out her hand in the manner of a woman who had decided some time ago that she would not wait for men to set the terms of introduction. He shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and he released her hand as quickly as courtesy allowed. "Your trunk is at the depot," he said. "I will bring it over before supper." "Thank you," she said. He nodded and turned back toward the dark interior of the stable, and that was the entirety of their first conversation. Ada watched him go for just a moment, then gathered her carpetbag in her direction and walked down the street toward the boarding house, which had a painted sign above the door that read Fenn's rooms and bore in letters that had once been red, and were now faded to a dusty rose by the Kansas sun. Mrs. Doris Fenn was a small woman of about 50 with silver hair and sharp brown eyes, and the brisk manner of someone who had been running things on her own for a long time and had made her peace with it. She met Ada at the door and pulled her inside and immediately began making tea in the way that some women make tea in a crisis, which is to say with great purposefulness and the clear conviction that hot liquid and a straight-backed chair will solve most things. "You look exhausted," Mrs. Fenn said, setting a cup in front of Ada with the authority of a diagnosis. "4 days on the stage from St. Louis," Ada confirmed. "Did Atkins see to the trunk?" "He said he would bring it before supper." Mrs. Fenn made a small sound that was not quite a grunt and not quite an acknowledgement. "He will. He is reliable enough. Just do not expect conversation out of him." She sat down across from Ada and folded her hands on the table. "He has not always been like that, mind you, but he has been like that for 2 years now, and I have stopped expecting it to change." Ada wrapped her hands around the teacup and let the warmth seep into her palms. "What happened 2 years ago?" she asked, because she was a practical woman and preferred to understand the landscape she was walking into. Mrs. Fenn's expression shifted in a way that suggested the question was reasonable, but the answer was painful, at least on someone else's behalf. "He lost his wife," she said simply. "Catherine. She was a lovely girl. Fever took her in the summer of '80. He has been managing the stable and not much else since then. Stays to himself, keeps the horses well, does not cause trouble." She paused. "Does not seem to take much joy in anything either." Ada absorbed this information the way she absorbed most information, quietly and without immediate comment, filing it away in the part of her mind that dealt with human beings and their various wounds. She had come to Caldwell to work as Mrs. Fenn's assistant, helping manage the boarding house, doing the account books, which she was considerably skilled at, and occasionally helping in the kitchen. She had come because St. Louis had grown too small in the way that places grow too small after a loss, and Ada had had her own share of those. Her father had died the previous winter, and her mother had passed 3 years before that, and the house on Clement Street had been sold to cover debts, and she had found herself at 24 years old with a good education, a head for numbers, a quiet determination, and no particular reason to stay where she was. She had answered Mrs. Fenn's advertisement in the newspaper with the straightforward logic of a woman who understood that sometimes the best cure for a place that has become too heavy with sadness is to find yourself a completely different place and begin again. Caldwell was certainly a different place. It was a cattle town, which meant it had the particular energy of somewhere that existed primarily as a destination rather than a home, a town where things arrived and then moved on, cattle and cowboys and commerce and trouble, all of it streaming through in a constant current. The Santa Fe Trail ran through here, and the cattle drives from Texas came up the Kishom Trail and ended here. And in the season, the streets filled with drovers who were tired and loud and occasionally dangerous, and nearly always in need of a hot meal and a cold drink, and a place to sleep that was not the open ground. Ada learned the rhythms of the boarding house quickly because she was good at learning rhythms. She took over the account books from Mrs. Fenn within the first week and discovered they were in modest disorder. Nothing catastrophic, but several months of entries that had been made in haste and needed reconciling. She sat at the small desk in the back room each evening after supper and worked through them with the patient thoroughness of someone who finds numbers genuinely comforting, their fixed and reliable logic a relief after the uncertainty of human affairs. Patrick Atkins brought her trunk that first evening as promised, arriving with it balanced on a flat cart pulled by a calm gray horse, and he carried the trunk inside without being asked and set it in the room Mrs. Fenn had assigned to Ada on the second floor. Ada thanked him from the doorway, and he nodded and left, and the entire exchange lasted perhaps 45 seconds. She saw him every few days after that, as Caldwell was not a large town, and the livery stable was a necessary institution in a place where horses were the primary mode of transportation, and the cattle trade meant there were always animals requiring care. She would pass him on the street sometimes, or see him across the yard when he brought the boarding house's old mare back from shoeing. He always acknowledged her with a nod. He never initiated conversation. He answered direct questions with the minimum of words required to answer them. He was polite in the way of a man who has not forgotten his manners, but has simply stopped finding much use for them. The other boarders and the townspeople filled in the picture of Patrick Atkins for Ada over the following weeks, not because she asked, but because small towns explain their own mysteries whether you request the explanation or not. He had come to Caldwell in 1877, 5 years ago, with his wife Catherine, who had been from Ohio and had been gentle and laughing, and had loved the wide sky of Kansas with an enthusiasm that made even the old-timers smile. He had built the livery stable up from a 2-stall operation to a proper 12-stall enterprise in those 3 years, working long days with a cheerfulness that several people described to Ada with a kind of wistful precision, as though they were recalling a weather pattern that had since been replaced by a permanent overcast. Then Catherine died, and the cheerfulness went with her. He had not spoken unkindly to anyone in those 2 years, not exactly. He had not been cruel or rude. He had simply withdrawn, sealed himself behind something that looked like competence and industry, kept the stable running, paid his debts, fed his horses, and offered the world nothing beyond the functional minimum. Ada thought about this more than she should have, probably. She was not sure why his particular form of grief interested her. There were plenty of sad people in the world, and she had her own sadness to manage without borrowing someone else's. But something about the quality of Patrick Atkins's silence struck her as different from ordinary grief. It was not the silence of a man who had given up. It was the silence of a man who had decided that if he did not reach toward anything, then nothing could be taken from him again. She recognized that feeling. She had flirted with it herself in the months after her father's death, when the temptation to simply contract into a smaller and safer version of herself had been considerable. She had chosen not to, but she understood the appeal. The incident that changed things was small. That is the thing about the moments that change things. They are almost always small. It was a Tuesday morning in late April, 6 weeks after Ada had arrived in Caldwell. She was on her way to the general store for Mrs. Fenn, carrying a list written in Mrs. Fenn's cramped handwriting and a basket for the dry goods. The weather had gone strange overnight, a late cold snap dropping a thin, surprising frost onto the prairie, and the morning air had that particular bite that comes when spring forgets itself briefly and turns winter again. She was passing the livery stable when she heard a sound that stopped her. It was a low, distressed kind of sound, not quite a whimper and not quite a groan, and it was coming from the side of the stable where the water trough stood. She stepped around the corner of the building and found a large chestnut horse standing with its head low and its right foreleg held slightly off the ground, and Patrick Atkins crouched beside it in the cold, his hands moving carefully along the horse's leg with that particular focused attention that belongs to people who genuinely love animals. He had not heard her come around the corner, or if he had, he was too focused on the horse to acknowledge it. His face in profile showed something she had not seen there before. Not exactly softness, but the absence of the guard he usually kept up. He was talking to the horse in a low murmur, the words indistinct, but the tone carrying the quiet reassurance of someone who means it. Ada stood there for a moment, caught by the unexpectedness of it, this man who did not speak being tender with a horse in the cold early morning while most of the town was still eating breakfast. Then she noticed something else. His coat was hanging over the fence post, and he had given it to the horse. Not literally, of course, but he had draped his heavy work coat over the horse's back, and was himself in just his shirt in the cold, clearly having decided that the horse needed the warmth more than he did. It was such a specific, unconsidered kindness, the kind that a person does without thinking because their first instinct is to take care of the creature in front of them, that Ada felt something shift in her chest, a small rearrangement of her assessment of Patrick Atkins. She would have walked on, would have left him to it, except that she noticed his hands. They were moving along the horse's foreleg, checking for damage, but they were also shaking not from nerves, she could see that, but from the cold. He had been out here long enough in his shirt sleeves that the frost was in his bones. She went back to the boarding house. She was gone for perhaps 4 minutes, and when she came back around the corner of the stable, she was carrying a cup of coffee from the pot on Mrs. Fenn's stove that had been fresh brewed 20 minutes ago and was still hot. Patrick did not hear her until she was standing beside him, and when he looked up his expression was that of a man interrupted in something private, a brief unguarded surprise before the usual careful blankness came down. She held out the cup. "I thought you might need this," she said. He looked at the cup. He looked at her. Something moved in those green-gray eyes, something quick and complicated that was gone before she could identify it. He took the cup. And then she said the thing, the small thing, and she said it simply and without intention of undoing anything, simply because it was true and she saw no reason not to say it. "That was kind," she said, gesturing at the coat draped over the horse's back. "What you did with your coat, that was a kind thing." He looked at the cup in his hands. He did not say anything for a moment, and she thought perhaps she had made him uncomfortable, which had not been her aim, and she was about to say that she would let him get on with it and walk away, when he said, very quietly, "He pulled up lame on the cold stones this morning. Could not leave him standing in it." His voice had something in it that it did not usually have, something that was not quite raw but was not armored either. "What is his name?" she asked. He hesitated in a way that suggested the question surprised him. "Copper," he said. "Is the leg bad? Bruised, I think, not broken. He should be fine with a few days of care." He looked at the horse again, and that unguarded thing was in his face again, the thing that was not hardness. Ada nodded. "Good," she said. And then, because she had a basket to fill and a list to complete, she said, "I hope you warm up," and walked back around the corner of the building and continued on her way to the general store. She did not think much more about it that morning. She had her accounts to do, and 3 new boarders arriving before the week was out, 2 cattle buyers from Wichita and a surveyor from the railroad company, and Mrs. Fenn's larder needed stocking. But something had changed, though she did not know it yet, and Patrick Atkins, crouching in the cold with the coffee cup warming his hands and the aftertaste of being thanked for something doing something he could not name in the center of his chest, also did not know it yet. He finished seeing to Copper. He drank the coffee. He carried the cup back to the boarding house and set it on the porch railing because he was not going to leave Mrs. Fenn short of a cup, and then he stood there for a moment in the thin spring sunlight and looked at the faded red paint on the boarding house wall and thought about nothing in particular with more attention than he had given to nothing in a very long time. He went back to the stable and mucked out 3 stalls and repaired a broken harness ring and reshod a dun gelding belonging to a drover who was heading back south in the morning. And all of this was ordinary and routine, and he had done it 1,000 times, but the whole day had a slightly different quality to it, like a familiar piece of music played in a different key. Not better or worse, exactly. Just different. He noticed he was thinking about Ada Atwood. He tried not to, as a matter of principle, because thinking about people was how you ended up caring about them, and caring about people was how you ended up with the particular kind of pain he had been carrying for 2 years, and was not interested in adding to. But she kept appearing in his mind with that straightforward directness of hers, the way she had simply brought him coffee without making a production of it, the way she had said that was a kind thing, the way you would state a simple fact rather than a compliment, and the way she had asked Copper's name as though it mattered, which it did, but people did not usually think to ask. 2 days later, he was working at the fence on the east side of the corral when Ada Atwood came out of the boarding house and crossed the yard to hang washing on the line that ran between the house and the old oak tree. He could see her through the fence rails, her dark hair pinned up under a plain calico bonnet, her movements efficient and unhurried. She was humming something he did not recognize, very quietly, more to herself than for any audience. He kept working. He did not call out to her. Calling out to people was not something he did. But she turned at some point and saw him through the rails and raised her hand in the easy way she had, the way that acknowledged another person without demanding anything of them, and he found himself raising his hand back before he had decided to do it. She went back to her washing. He went back to the fence. But the humming continued, soft and present, and he thought it was pleasant to hear. When she was done with the washing and had picked up her empty basket, she did not walk away immediately. She walked to the fence instead and rested her arms on the top rail, not in the manner of someone with a purpose, but in the manner of someone who has a moment, and has decided to spend it standing in the sunshine looking at the prairie beyond the corral. "Copper is looking better," she said, noticing the horse standing in the corral with his weight distributed evenly, the injured foreleg no longer favored. Patrick set down his tools and stood up and looked at the horse, who was indeed looking better. "He is," Patrick agreed. "You did well by him," she said. He did not answer that. He was not sure how to. He had not had much practice recently at receiving observations about himself that were meant as anything other than a transaction. "How long have you had him?" she asked. He considered the question. "4 years," he said. "I bought him in Abilene. He was half-starved and badly shod, and the man selling him was asking too little, which I took as evidence that something was wrong with him." He paused. Nothing was wrong with him. He just needed looking after. Ada smiled at that. It was a genuine smile, the kind that started in the eyes, and it did something to the quality of her face that he noticed despite himself. "That is often how it is," she said. He was not entirely sure whether she was still talking about the horse. She pushed off from the fence rail after a moment and said she had better get back to her accounts, and she walked back to the boarding house with the empty basket over her arm, and Patrick stood by the fence with his hands at his sides, and the odd feeling that the day had been fuller than usual without anything particular having happened in it. Over the following weeks, a pattern developed without either of them designing it. It was the natural pattern of two people who live in proximity and are not unfriendly and whose days occasionally overlap. But it was also more than that, or it was becoming more than that in the slow, almost geological way that things become something in people who are being careful. She began to leave coffee on the porch railing in the mornings on the cold days, just a cup with a small cloth draped over it to hold the heat, and he began to make a point of checking whether it was there, which meant he was making a point of looking toward the boarding house in the mornings, which was new. He never commented on the coffee. She never mentioned it, but he always returned the cup. He began to do small things without quite meaning to. When he noticed that the boarding house's gutter had come loose on the south corner and rain was running down the wall and pooling against the foundation, he repaired it one afternoon while Ada was at the store and Mrs. Fenn was at her sister's. He did not mention it to either of them. Mrs. Fenn noticed it when she came home and called it a mystery, and Patrick said nothing when she reported it to him, which meant she suspected him eventually, because Caldwell was that kind of town. He found himself thinking about Ada at odd moments. Not in the sentimental, painful way he had thought about Catherine, which had been all full color and warmth and then all absence. This was something different, something more tentative, like light coming through a crack in a wall rather than a window thrown open. It was the thought of her directness and her practicality, and the way she laughed at things, not with performance but with actual amusement, and the way she treated his silences as though they were acceptable rather than deficient. Most people treated his silences as a problem to be solved. They filled them with conversation or with the particular brightness of someone trying to cheer a person up, which he had always found exhausting, because it required him to perform a responsiveness he did not feel. Ada simply let the silences be silences. She spoke when she had something to say, and she was quiet when she did not. And this was so refreshing in a way he could not fully articulate that he found himself looking forward to their brief conversations at the fence or the porch, in a way he had not looked forward to anything for a very long time. It was Mrs. Fenn who first put words to what was happening, though she put them only to herself and communicated them primarily through the medium of not saying anything about it, which was her particular way of encouraging things she approved of by not interfering with them. She watched Patrick Atkins and Ada Atwood across the yard and through the kitchen window and from the porch, and she saw the way a man who had stopped reaching was starting to reach again, slowly and carefully, the way a hand reaches toward a fire when it has been cold too long and is not entirely sure the fire is safe. The first real conversation, the first one that lasted long enough to count as a conversation rather than an exchange, happened on a May evening when the sunset over the Kansas prairie was doing what Kansas sunsets do in May, which is to say it was turning the whole sky into something that looked like a cathedral window, all deep gold and burning orange, and a purple at the edges that ached a little to look at. Ada was sitting on the porch after supper with a book she was not really reading, because the sunset made reading feel like an insult to what was happening in the sky, and Patrick was leading 2 horses he had just shod back into the stable when he stopped. He did not intend to stop, but the sunset was doing its thing and he stopped. Ada noticed him standing there and said without preamble, "I keep trying to decide if this country is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen or the most terrifying." Patrick looked at her. This was the kind of statement that required either a real response or nothing at all, and for the first time in 2 years he found he wanted to give a real response. "Both," he said. "It has always been both." She looked at the sky and nodded slowly. "You have been here long, 5 years this fall. Where before? Missouri, then Texas for a while, a pause. I am not from anywhere particularly the way some people are. I always felt like a man looking for the right place. And was this it?" He was quiet for a moment. "It became it," he said finally. She heard the weight in those 3 words, the whole story of Catherine and the stable and the 2 good years and the 1 terrible summer, and she did not press it. She simply looked at the sky and said, "I think I understand that. The feeling that a place becomes yours rather than the other way around." "Where are you from?" he asked. The question surprised him as much as it seemed to interest her. "St. Louis," she said. "My father was a school teacher. He believed very seriously in education and very practically in books, and we had more of both than was perhaps necessary for the house we lived in." She smiled. "I grew up with books in every corner and a father who thought that knowing a thing fully was always better than knowing it partially, regardless of whether knowing it fully was comfortable." "Sounds like a good man," Patrick said. "He was," she said simply. "He died last winter. It is one of the reasons I am here." He understood that perfectly. He understood it in the way you understand something with your body rather than your mind. They talked for another hour, as the sunset burned down to embers and the stars came out over the Kansas prairie, hard and clear and impossibly numerous, the way the stars are when there is nothing between you and the sky for 50 miles in every direction. They talked about small things and occasionally about large ones, and at some point Mrs. Fenn came out with 2 more cups of coffee and set them down without comment, and went back inside with the particular satisfaction of a woman who is watching something go right. Patrick went home that night, which was a room above the stable that he had furnished with the minimum required and nothing extra, and he sat on the edge of his bed and looked at the wall and tried to understand the feeling in his chest, which was unfamiliar enough that he was having trouble categorizing it. It was not happiness exactly. It was more like the memory of happiness, or the beginning of the possibility of it, which was both more tentative and in some ways more significant. He told himself it was nothing. He was a practical man, and he understood the logic of not building towards something that could be taken away. He had the evidence of his own life that things could be taken away, suddenly and completely, without warning and without justice or mercy, and the cost of that was a thing he was not sure he could pay twice. But Ada Atwood brought him coffee on cold mornings and thanked him for simple things and asked the name of his horse and looked at the sunset like it deserved looking at. And Patrick Atkins, who had not spoken a kind word to anyone in 2 years because kindness was a door, and he was not sure he could survive what came through doors anymore, found himself at the end of that May evening thinking that maybe he had forgotten to stop. Forgotten to stop building the wall. Forgotten to stop keeping the distance. Forgotten to stop reaching. He did not sleep well that night, but it was not the bad not sleeping that had haunted him for 2 years, the thick, heavy absence of rest. It was the restless not sleeping of a person whose mind is busy with something worth being busy about, and he lay in the dark and listened to the horses moving below him in the stable, and thought about a woman with dark hair and practical hands, and a way of looking at things directly, and told himself this was foolishness, and did not entirely believe it. June came in hot and cold across the Kansas plains, and with it came the full surge of the cattle drives, the streets of Caldwell filling up with Texas drovers and the buyers from the eastern packing houses, and the particular chaos of commerce and dust, and a few thousand head of longhorn cattle being moved through a town that had been built for exactly this purpose, and still found it overwhelming every single year. The boarding house was full. Every bed was occupied, and Mrs. Fenn had Patrick rig up 2 additional cots in the back storeroom for overflow, and Ada was managing the accounts and the room assignments and the meal arrangements with the brisk efficiency that Mrs. Fenn increasingly relied on and never quite got around to sufficiently thanking her for, though Ada did not need thanking because she found the work satisfying in its complexity. Patrick's stable was likewise full to capacity, and he had hired a boy of about 16 named Thomas who was quick with horses and slow to talk, which suited Patrick very well. He was working 14-hour days, which was usual for June, and he was tired in the evenings in the straightforward physical way that is actually a relief after 2 years of the other kind of tired. He and Ada still met at the fence or the porch when the day's work permitted, which was less frequently than before, but the conversations they managed in those brief intervals had a quality of continuation about them, as though they were picking up something rather than starting something, which is the sign of 2 people who are becoming accustomed to each other in a way that goes deeper than acquaintance. He began to tell her things, not large things, not first, but small ones. He told her about a mare who was due to foal in 2 weeks, and who he was worried about because her first foaling had been difficult. He told her about a disagreement he had had with the town's blacksmith about the proper angle for shoeing a horse with a short pastern, which Ada followed with better comprehension than he had expected because her father had kept a horse in St. Louis, and she had paid attention. He told her about Missouri, a little, about the farm his family had kept, and the way the Missouri River had looked in the fall. She told him things in return. She told him about the accounts she had been reconciling, and the particular satisfaction of finding where a 6-month error had originated. She told him about a letter she had received from a friend in St. Louis who was getting married and who had asked Ada to come back for the wedding, which Ada had declined because the stage fare was considerable, and she had only been in Caldwell 2 months and could not yet afford to be away from her responsibilities. She told him about her brother James, who was working on the Missouri Pacific Railroad, and how she worried about him but wrote him every week. One evening she told him about her father in a fuller way, not just the fact of him but the substance of who he had been, the schoolteacher who had believed in education and books and had also, she said with a slight catch in her voice that she controlled very quickly, believed in his daughter in a way that had made her feel like someone who could do things, like someone whose opinions and intelligence were worth having. Patrick listened. He was good at listening, she had noticed. It was not the passive listening of someone waiting to speak. It was the listening of someone who is actually receiving what you are saying and giving it weight. He sounds like the kind of man who is hard to lose, Patrick said. Yes, Ada said. She looked at the ground for a moment and then looked back up and said, "You know what that is, I think." He was quiet for a moment. It was the first direct reference either of them had made to Catherine, though Catherine was always present in the periphery of their conversations, the way the sun is present even in shade. "I do," he said. "I am sorry," Ada said, and it was not a performance of sympathy. It was the simple and genuine acknowledgement of one person who has lost someone to another person who has lost someone, the particular solidarity of grief, which does not require elaboration to communicate. "Thank you," he said. It was, she realized later, the first time she had heard him say those 2 words to anyone. They stood in the evening quiet for a moment, and then Patrick said, "The mare foaled last night. She did well, actually. The foal is small but strong." "Can I see it?" Ada asked. He looked at her with something in his eyes that was surprised and also not surprised. "Come by in the morning," he said, "before it gets hot." She came by in the morning before it got hot, in a plain blue dress and her hair braided back, and Patrick led her into the foaling stall, and there was the mare, a bay named Rosie that he had owned for 3 years, standing with her new foal beside her. The foal was a dark chestnut with 4 white socks and a blaze on its face, and was at that stage of a foal's life where the legs seem disproportionately long, and the world seems disproportionately large, and everything is discovered with a kind of lunging, enthusiastic inexactitude. Ada laughed. It was a genuine, delighted laugh, the kind that happens when something is simply wonderful, and there is no reason not to let it show. She looked at Patrick and found him watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something open and almost startled, as though the sound of her laughing had arrived somewhere that had been closed for a long time and found the door unlocked. "He is wonderful," she said. "Does he have a name?" "Not yet," Patrick said. He was still watching her. "What do you think?" she asked. He considered the foal, who had at this moment managed to investigate his own legs with such enthusiasm that he had surprised himself and was now blinking in mild consternation. "Something with dignity," Patrick said, "to compensate for the current situation." Ada laughed again, and something in Patrick's chest did something that it had not done in 2 years, a sort of loosening, like a knot untied, like a window opened onto a room that had been shut. "Chester," Ada suggested. "It sounds dignified." Patrick looked at the foal, who had recovered his footing and was now attempting to investigate Rosie's hay with more determination than skill. "Chester," he said, as though testing the word. "All right." She smiled at him, and he found himself very nearly smiling back, which was, for Patrick Atkins in June of 1882, nearly revolutionary. The thing that brought everything into clarity was the arrival of a man named Dahlen Morris in the 2nd week of June. Dahlen Morris was a cattle broker from Dallas, who had been coming to Caldwell for 4 or 5 years, and who had the easy, expansive manner of a man accustomed to making deals and being accommodated. He was perhaps 35, well dressed by the standards of the cattle trade, and he had a way of occupying any room he entered that suggested he considered it already belonging to him. He had taken a room at Fenn's boarding house before, and he recognized Ada in the front parlor when she came to record his booking in the register, and he smiled at her with the broad, proprietary smile of a man who has decided he finds a woman interesting and sees no reason not to communicate this fact immediately. "Miss Atwood," he said, reading her name from the register. "You are new." "I have been here 2 months," she said, which she considered sufficient to convey that she was neither new enough to be unsettled by an introduction nor interested in what the smile was advertising. "Dallas," he said, as though this would impress her. "Dahlen Morris. I am here every June with the drives. You will find I am a very amiable boarder." "I hope so," Ada said pleasantly, and gave him his key and went back to the accounts. He was persistent in the way that men of his type are persistent, which is to say, he did not take the closed accounts for an answer, and instead made several opportunities over the following days to position himself as entertaining company, appearing in the dining room at mealtimes with anecdotes and opinions, and the clear intention of being admired. Ada was polite and professionally pleasant and thoroughly uninterested, which he interpreted, being of a particular type, as a challenge rather than a conclusion. Patrick, who noticed things he did not ask to notice, observed the way Dahlen Morris looked at Ada across the boarding house dining room on an evening when Patrick had been invited to supper by Mrs. Fenn, which happened rarely but occasionally. He noticed it and felt something he was not going to call jealousy, but which performed all the functions of jealousy, a tightening along the chest, and a sudden sharp awareness of the fact that Ada Atwood was a remarkable woman, and that someone who was not him was looking at her with intentions that were legible from across a room. He said nothing about it. He ate his supper and thanked Mrs. Fenn and went back to the stable. He lay awake thinking about things he had no right to think about yet, and getting increasingly impatient with himself for the avoiding of the subject he had been doing for 6 weeks. The matter resolved itself, or rather was resolved for him, the following afternoon. Ada was crossing the main street with the account books in her arm, heading to the bank for Mrs. Fenn, and Dallin Morris fell into step beside her with the familiarity of someone who has decided that proximity implies permission. "Miss Atwood," he said, "I am going to be in Caldwell another 3 weeks at least. I would very much like to take you to supper at the hotel on Saturday." Ada, who had developed clear opinions on the matter over the past week, said, "That is kind of you, Mr. Morris, but I am not interested, thank you." Dallin Morris was not accustomed to that kind of directness, and it showed. His expression shifted briefly from charm to something less attractive before he controlled it and put the smile back. "Well, I hope you will reconsider." "I will not," Ada said pleasantly, and continued on her way to the bank. Patrick, who had been in front of the hardware store across the street, arranging for a delivery of iron stock, had watched this exchange with the particular attention of a man trying to assess a situation from a distance. He had seen Ada's posture, which conveyed complete composure, and he had seen Dallin Morris's expression after she replied, which conveyed less pleasant things, and he had made several private assessments about Dallin Morris that he kept to himself because they were not his to act on unless Ada asked him to. But when she came back from the bank and he was still in front of the hardware store waiting for his delivery, she stopped. "He bothers you?" Patrick asked. It came out more directly than he intended. Ada looked at him. "I manage it," she said. "I know you do," he said, and then, before he could stop himself, "but you should not have to." There was a silence. Ada looked at him, and he looked at her, and something moved between them that was more than their usual exchange, something that acknowledged itself and did not pretend. "Patrick," she said, and she was the first person to use his first name without context, just his name, as though she had been saving it up. He looked at her. He was standing in the middle of the dusty street in the June heat with iron stock on his mind and something considerably more complicated in his chest. "I am not very good at this anymore," he said. It was the most honest thing he had said in 2 years. It cost him something to say it, and she could see that. "At what?" she asked, though she was fairly certain she knew. "At reaching toward things," he said, "at letting myself want things I could lose." Ada was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was level but warm and absolutely certain. "I understand that perfectly," she said. "I am not entirely without my own reasons to be careful." A pause. "But I have found lately that being careful and being closed are not the same thing, and I think you might have begun to notice that as well." He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon sun was fierce and the street was dusty, and somewhere down the block a horse was raising a complaint about something, and in the middle of all of it Patrick Atkins, who had not reached toward anything in 2 years, said, "Would you walk with me Sunday morning, along the creek before it gets hot?" Ada Atwood smiled. It was the real smile, the one that started in the eyes. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." Sunday morning was clear and cool, and the prairie grass along the creek north of town was so green it seemed improbable. The creek itself was running well, the spring snowmelt from the mountains to the west still filling it, and the cottonwoods along its banks had their new leaves out, that particular yellow-green of early summer that is almost a color you can taste. They walked for an hour. They talked without the background of work or other people, and the difference was considerable. Patrick found himself talking more freely than he had in a long time, not just answering questions, but actually offering things, observations and memories, and 1 or 2 opinions about the nature of the cattle trade that he had been keeping to himself for years for no better reason than that he had stopped talking. Ada talked too, more personally than she had before, about what she hoped for, not in the grand way but in the specific way of a practical woman. She hoped to have her own home someday, not necessarily large but her own. She hoped to continue with work that used her mind properly. She hoped, she said with a slight smile, for a view of the sky. She had discovered she could not live without a view of the sky. Patrick listened to all of this and said, "The sky here is the best you will find anywhere." "I am beginning to agree with you," she said. At one point, they stopped at a bend in the creek where the bank widened into a small, flat space, and the cottonwood shade was thick, and the sound of the water covered everything else. They stood and looked at the creek for a moment, and Ada turned her face up to where the light came through the leaves and closed her eyes briefly, the way a person does when they are receiving something, and Patrick looked at her and thought that he had been wrong about himself. He had thought he was someone who could not reach toward things anymore, someone hollowed out by loss and sealed by grief, and he had believed this with enough conviction to live by it for 2 years. But standing here beside Ada Atwood on a June Sunday morning with the creek running and the cottonwoods making their soft sound in the breeze, he understood that he had not been sealed. He had been waiting without knowing he was waiting, the way a field lies fallow between seasons, still holding everything it needs. He did not say any of this. He was not a man who spoke in such terms, but he looked at Ada and said, "I am glad you came to Caldwell." She opened her eyes and looked at him. The directness in her gaze was something he had learned to appreciate rather than brace for. "So am I," she said. He reached out and took her hand, which was there at her side, and she let him, and they stood that way for a while by the creek with the cottonwoods making their sound and the summer beginning around them, and it felt like something that had been shut for a long time opening up, slowly and carefully, and with the particular reverence of people who know the cost of things and are choosing to pay it anyway. Dallin Morris left Caldwell 3 weeks later after completing his business, and his departure went unlamented by Ada and unnoticed by Patrick, except as the removal of a minor irritant. The summer deepened into the full heat of July and August, the cattle drives winding down, and the town returning to its smaller, quieter self. Patrick and Ada established a rhythm that the whole of Caldwell noted and approved of, because small towns take a proprietary interest in their own love stories, and everyone from Mrs. Fenn to the livery boy Thomas had observed the development of this one, and considered it overdue. They walked together on Sunday mornings when the work permitted and occasionally in the evenings along the quieter streets, and they ate supper together at the boarding house several nights a week in the company of Mrs. Fenn and whatever boarders were present, and the conversations at the fence and the porch continued and deepened. Patrick found things coming back to him that he had thought were permanently gone. Laughter, for one thing. Not the large, performed kind, but the small, involuntary kind that happens when something is genuinely funny, which Ada frequently was in the dry, understated way that he found unexpectedly delightful. He found himself caring about the quality of days in a way he had stopped caring. He found himself looking forward to things. He told her about Catherine. He had not talked about Catherine to anyone in 2 years, not because the subject was forbidden, but because talking about her felt like pressing on something that would not survive the pressure, and he had not trusted himself or anyone else to handle it carefully. But one evening in late July, sitting on the porch while the heat eased and the crickets started up across the prairie, Ada asked him gently how they had met, and he found he could answer, and found that the answer did not break him. "In Abilene," he said. "She had come out with her family. Her father was a merchant. She was the one who laughed at everything, which I found terrifying and then indispensable." A pause. She thought Kansas was the most beautiful place she had ever seen, and she never stopped thinking so, which I respected because most people change their mind about Kansas the first time the weather turns bad. "It is beautiful," Ada said. "She would have liked you," Patrick said, and meant it, and found that saying it was possible and even right. Catherine had been generous and she had liked directness, and she had believed, with considerable passion, that people should live fully and gladly and reach for what mattered to them. And Patrick thought, quietly and with something that was grief and also something else, that he believed she would not have wanted this particular closing down that he had done in her name. Ada did not say anything for a moment. When she did, she said, "I am sorry you lost her. And I think she sounds like she was exactly the kind of person the world needs more of." "She was," he said. Then, because Ada was who she was, she said, She would also have had opinions about the state of your parlor above the stable, I suspect, because from what I could see through the window the other day it is in considerable need of attention." Patrick looked at her, startled, and then laughed, the real kind, and it came out rough and a little unpracticed from 2 years of disuse, but it was genuine, and Ada looked at him with a smile that had warmth in it like a banked fire, steady and real. The summer became fall, which in Kansas has a particular quality, the heat easing and the sky going that deep September blue that looks like nothing else in the world, and the grasses on the prairie going gold and brown, and the air carrying a crispness that is not yet cold, but is the conversation before cold. Patrick had begun to see his life in different terms. He had been running the livery in a workmanlike way for 2 years, keeping it functional and profitable because there was no sense in not, but without any vision beyond the immediate. Now he found himself thinking forward. The stable had room for expansion on the east side. He had been looking at a piece of land north of town that a farmer was willing to sell, good grass, a reliable water source, suitable for a small horse breeding operation to supplement the livery income. Chester, Rosie's foal, was growing into something promising, and Patrick had an eye for horses that was close to an art. He mentioned the land to Ada one Sunday, not as a plan exactly, but as an idea he was turning over, and she asked him detailed and intelligent questions about it, about the acreage and the water rights and the asking price and what the operational costs would be in the first year. And by the end of the conversation, they had effectively done a preliminary business analysis together, which Patrick found both useful and deeply appealing. "You should do it," Ada said. "The numbers make sense." "You sound very certain," he said. "I am very certain," she agreed. "I have been doing accounts professionally for long enough to know when a number makes sense and when someone is hoping it makes sense, and this actually makes sense." He looked at her in the September afternoon with the gold light on everything and said, "Ada." She looked at him. He was not a man who spoke flowery words and had no intention of starting, but he was a man who believed in being direct about things that mattered, and this mattered. "I have been thinking about the future in a way I had stopped thinking about it," he said. "And you are in it, not as a neighbor or a friend, more than that. I want to be direct with you because I think you prefer directness." Ada looked at him with those clear, direct eyes and said, "I do prefer directness. I would like to court you properly," he said, "with the intention of something permanent if you are willing to consider it." Ada was quiet for a moment, but it was not the quiet of uncertainty. It was the quiet of a woman who has thought about something carefully and is choosing her words with equal care. "Patrick," she said, "I came to Caldwell looking for a fresh start. I was not looking for you specifically. But I found you, or you found me, in the way of the coffee and the fence and the creek and all of it, and I think it has been the most unexpected and the most right thing that has happened to me in a very long time. A breath. I am not afraid of permanence. I am afraid of pretending something is permanent when it is not. But what I feel when I am with you is not something I need to pretend." He reached across and took her hand again, as he had done at the creek in June, and she turned her hand in his and held it, and between them was the solid warmth of something decided. He asked her to marry him in October, on a Thursday evening after supper, standing in Mrs. Fenn's back garden with the last of the season's marigolds still yellow against the fence, and the stars coming out above the prairie. He had a ring, a plain gold band that he had bought from the jeweler in Wichita on a supply run the previous week, choosing it with the kind of care he brought to choosing horses, looking for what was good and true rather than what was merely impressive. He said, "I know I am not always easy company. I know I spent 2 years making myself into someone who did not reach for anything. I am not that person anymore, or I am working at not being that person anymore, and I think that has mostly to do with you." He looked at the ring in his hand and then at Ada. "I would like to spend the rest of my life working at it with you beside me if you will have me." Ada looked at him and then at the ring and then at him again, and her eyes were bright in the way of a person who is fully, clearly, wholly present in a moment. "Yes," she said, I will have you." He put the ring on her finger. It fit as though it had been made for her, which was either luck or something more than luck, and he held her hand and looked at her in the October evening and felt, quietly and without drama, like a man who has come home. Mrs. Fenn, who had been watching from the kitchen window with the careful inattentiveness of someone who absolutely is not watching, said finally to the dark kitchen window and went to put the kettle on. They were married in November in Caldwell's small church, which held about 60 people and had 63 in it on that day because word had gotten around, as it does in small towns, and nobody wanted to miss it. Mrs. Fenn stood as Ada's witness. Thomas, the livery boy, stood as Patrick's because Patrick had, in the slow thaw of the preceding months, become someone Thomas looked up to in the careful way that young people look up to those who treat them with steady respect. The minister was a man named Reverend Caleb Holt, who had been in Caldwell for 3 years, and had married and buried more people than he could count, and still found each ceremony worth the gravity of it. He performed the ceremony with the plain seriousness it deserved, and when he said the words about 2 people becoming one household, one life, one bearing of the other's burdens, Patrick looked at Ada and Ada looked at Patrick, and between them was something that required no translation. Ada wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had sewn herself from fabric she had bought in Wichita, not elaborate but well made, with small pearl buttons at the collar that had belonged to her mother. Patrick wore his good black coat and a white shirt, and he had gotten his hair cut, finally, which drew quiet commentary from several people present. After the ceremony, there was a modest celebration at the boarding house because Mrs. Fenn had insisted, with tables set up in the dining room and the yard and food that she and Ada had been preparing for 2 days, and someone brought a fiddle, and someone else brought a guitar, and the November evening was unexpectedly warm, and the stars came out early over Caldwell, Kansas, and the little celebration went on until well past 10 o'clock. Patrick danced with Ada, which was notable because Patrick had not danced in 2 years and was not entirely certain he remembered how. But Ada took his hand and they found the rhythm together, which seemed to both of them like a reasonable metaphor for everything else. They moved into the stable's living quarters together immediately after, which were, as Ada had observed through the window, in considerable need of attention. She set about it with her practical thoroughness, not making it unrecognizable but making it livable, adding curtains she had sewn from a remnant of checked cotton, and rearranging the furniture so the room had light and air, and the particular quality of a space that a person has thought about rather than merely occupied. Patrick watched her do this with a feeling in his chest that he had given up on having and was now somewhat overwhelmed by, the feeling of being at home. He bought the land north of town in December, the 50 acres with the good grass and the reliable water, and Ada went over the purchase agreement with the same forensic attention she brought to every set of numbers and confirmed that it was sound. They began making plans for the spring, for fencing and a small barn and the beginning of what they were thinking of as the horse operation, with Chester and Rosie as the foundation. Winter in Kansas was its own education for Ada, who had known Missouri winters but had not encountered the particular combination of wind and cold and horizontal snow that the Kansas plains delivered without apology. Patrick had grown accustomed to it and showed her the practical management of it, the proper insulation of pipes, and the management of the stable's heating and the importance of good boots, of which he had 3 pairs and she had, initially, 1. She bought 2 more pairs of boots in January. She bought them from the dry goods store on a bitter Tuesday morning, when the thermometer had not been above 12 degrees for 5 days, and Patrick had pointed out, with the gentle practicality of a man who had decided that keeping his wife warm was a personal mission, that 1 pair of boots was inadequate for a Kansas winter. She bought the boots and came home and showed them to him, and he said, "Good," and that single word contained more affection than most people could fit into a paragraph. That was the winter Ada understood who Patrick Atkins was, fully and completely. Not the version sealed by grief, not the man who did not speak, but the actual man who showed his love in consistent and practical ways, who was steady when the weather turned bad and thoughtful when she was tired, and who laughed more readily now with each passing week, as though the muscle of it were coming back. He told her things he had not told anyone. He was a man who had loved one person with great completeness, and had thought that part of him was finished, and he had discovered it was not. Ada discovered she was pregnant in March, when Caldwell was still gray and cold, but the light was coming back, the long evenings of winter beginning to shorten. She had suspected for 2 weeks before she was certain, and when she was certain she sat with it for a day because she needed to hold something that large by herself for a moment before she shared it. She told Patrick on a Sunday morning, the same kind of Sunday morning they had spent walking by the creek the summer before, though this one was at the kitchen table with coffee and the gray light of March coming through the new curtains, and she told him simply, the way she told him everything, with directness and without performance. Patrick looked at her across the table and said nothing for a moment, and the saying nothing was not the old closed silence but the new kind, the kind full of something that was too large for words to arrive at immediately. Then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and when he looked up his eyes were bright in the way of a man who has been given something he had stopped believing was possible. "Are you well?" he asked, because he was a practical man and his first thought was always for her welfare. "I am perfectly well," she said, tired and occasionally unreasonably annoyed by the smell of horses, which I recognize as inconvenient given our occupation. He laughed. The real laugh, the one she had given back to him, the one that started in his chest. "We will manage," he said. Spring came across the Kansas prairie like it always did, in a rush of green and wind and improbable color, the wildflowers coming up across the land north of town, their 50 acres of new grass growing in with the reliability Patrick had known it would. He built the new barn with the help of Thomas and 2 men from town, working through the warm April days with the satisfaction of a man building something that will last. And Ada brought lunch out to the site and sat on the fence rail, and watched the walls go up with the expression of someone who is watching a future take shape. Chester had grown into a beautiful horse, dark chestnut and intelligent, and with the particular disposition that means a horse can be trained to anything. Patrick had been working with him through the winter, and by spring he was well enough schooled that Patrick was confident about his future as a stud prospect. The horse operation was real and growing, built on the foundation of good judgment and careful work, which was how everything Patrick built was built. The baby came in October, a month after their first anniversary, in the way of first babies, which is to say with more drama and less timing than anyone had planned. Mrs. Fenn was there because Mrs. Fenn would not have been elsewhere, and the doctor came from 2 streets over, a competent young man named Dr. Warren, who had been in Caldwell for a year and inspired confidence. The baby was a boy. Patrick was present for the delivery in the manner of a man who has decided that being useful is more important than being comfortable, bringing water and being exactly where Ada told him to be, and holding her hand through the worst of it with a grip that communicated everything he was unable to say in the moment. When Dr. Warren placed the baby in Ada's arms, and Ada looked at her son for the first time, the expression on her face was one Patrick kept in his memory for the rest of his life. It was the look of a woman receiving the thing she had not known was the center of everything until it arrived. They named him Henry, for Ada's father. Patrick held Henry for the first time in the early morning, when Ada was sleeping and the room was quiet, and the October stars were doing their thing outside the window over the prairie. He held this small, new person with the careful certainty of someone who has held frightened animals and knows how to be still. Henry looked up at him with the unfocused gravity of the newborn, and Patrick said, quietly, "Hello, Henry, I am your father. We have a lot of horses to look after." It was the kind of thing Ada told him later that Catherine would have found exactly right. The years that followed were the years that make a life. They were not years without difficulty, because no years are, and the West in the 1880s had its own share of hard things. The cattle trade shifted and changed as the railroad extended and fencing began to close the open range. There were years of drought on the plains that made the summer brutal and the pasture thin. There was a winter in '84 that was the worst in a generation, the kind of cold that kills livestock and freezes pipes and requires everything a person has to simply survive. Patrick lost 6 horses that winter, which was a blow to the operation, and he and Ada sat together at the kitchen table and looked at the numbers and then looked at each other and decided what could be sold and what could be kept and what could be rebuilt in the spring. They rebuilt in the spring. They always rebuilt in the spring. That was the thing about the West. Ada had decided. It broke things and it grew things in alternation, and the people who lasted were the ones who had learned that the breaking was not the end of the story. Mrs. Fenn retired from running the boarding house in '85, selling the property to a young couple from Nebraska and moving to live with her sister in Topeka. Before she left, she had supper with Patrick and Ada and 3-year-old Henry, who was a vigorous, cheerful boy with his mother's directness and his father's steadiness, and she looked at the 3 of them across the table and said, with the satisfaction of someone who has seen a thing through from the beginning, "I believe everything turned out as it should." "It did," Ada said, and reached across the table and covered Patrick's hand with hers, which was a gesture she had made so many times by now that it was as natural and necessary as breathing. Patrick turned his hand and held hers, as he always did, and said to Mrs. Fenn, "We owe you a considerable debt for that first advertisement." Mrs. Fenn waved this away with the brisk practicality of a woman who knows her own role in things but does not require credit for it. "You owe each other," she said. "That is how it ought to be." They had a second child in '86, a girl they named Margaret, who arrived with considerably less drama than Henry and who had, from the first weeks of her life, the quality of a person who has assessed the situation and found it satisfactory. She had Patrick's eyes, that green-gray that changed in the light, and Ada's dark hair, and Henry adored her with the uncomplicated devotion of a 4-year-old who has been told he has a sister and found the reality exceeds the promise. The horse operation had grown into something substantial by this point. Patrick had the 50 acres running well and had acquired another 20 along the creek when the opportunity arose. And Chester, now 4 years old and fully the horse Patrick had hoped he would be, had sired several foals that were bringing good prices at the Wichita sales. The livery stable was managed in partnership with Thomas, who was now 20, and had developed into a capable horseman with a good eye and Patrick's trust, which was not a thing Patrick gave easily, and Thomas knew it. Ada ran the accounts for both operations and had extended her bookkeeping skills to 3 other businesses in Caldwell, the hardware store, and the dry goods merchant, and the new hotel that had gone up on the main street, doing their books on contract at a rate she had negotiated with the directness that had characterized her from the beginning. She was not a woman who stayed still, which Patrick had known from the first week and had never wanted to change. On a September evening in 1887, 5 years after Ada had first ridden into Caldwell on the stage with the wind pulling at her bonnet, Patrick and Ada sat on the porch of their house north of town, the house he had built in '84 to replace the stable's living quarters, a proper house with 4 rooms and a good stone fireplace and windows that faced the prairie. Henry was inside with a book, practicing the reading his mother had been teaching him with considerable rigor. Margaret was asleep in her cradle near the fire. The horses were in the pasture in the blue dusk, Chester among them, his dark chestnut coat catching the last of the light. Ada was leaning against Patrick's shoulder with the easy comfort of a woman who has been doing this long enough that it is simply where she belongs, and Patrick's arm was around her in the way of a man who has stopped trying to be careful about what he might lose and decided instead to hold it properly. The prairie was doing its evening thing, the grass going silver in the fading light, and the sky above it going through its colors, the deep gold and the orange and the purple at the edges, the Kansas sky that had been one of the first things they had talked about, really talked about, on that porch in May of '82. "Do you remember," Ada said, "the first time you asked me to walk with you by the creek, what you said before you asked?" "That I was not very good at reaching toward things," Patrick said. "And then you did," she said. "You made it easier," he said. "You made it seem possible." Ada lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him in the September evening and said, "You were always possible. You just needed someone to remind you." He looked at her. It struck him, not for the first time, that this was the most important thing that had ever happened to him. The particular intersection of a small act of kindness in a cold morning, and a woman who did not let him stay closed, and the whole life that had grown from it. This house and these children and this land and this partnership, and this love that had built itself from practical, daily, unremarkable devotion into something as solid and enduring as anything he had ever known. He thought about the morning in the cold with Copper, the coffee, the way she had said that was a kind thing with such simple certainty, as though it was just a fact being stated, and how that simple statement had done something to him he could not name then and could name now, had cracked something open that he had thought he had sealed permanently. He had not spoken a kind word to anyone in 2 years, and she had thanked him for something small, and he had forgotten to stop. "Thank you," he said. He said it quietly, the way he said the things that mattered most, without preamble or elevation, just the truth of it. Ada knew exactly what he was thanking her for, and she knew he knew that she knew because that was how they were. She smiled the smile that started in the eyes. "Any time," she said. He held her closer, and they sat together in the September evening on the porch of the house they had built together on the Kansas prairie, and the stars came out above them, hard and clear and impossibly numerous, and the horses moved in the pasture. And inside the house, Henry read his book and Margaret slept in her cradle, and the life they had made held them like a cup holds water, sufficient and real. In the years that followed, Caldwell changed and the West changed with it, as it always had been changing and always would. The great cattle drives that had made the town came to their end as the railroads pushed further south, and the fenced ranges altered the mathematics of the trade. Caldwell became quieter, more settled, the particular wildness of the frontier town giving way to something more domestic as the decade moved toward its end, and the century moved toward its own. Patrick and Ada moved with it. The horse breeding operation remained and grew, because good horses were needed regardless of whether there were cattle drives, and Patrick had established a reputation across the region for quality and fair dealing that brought buyers from Wichita and Kansas City and further. The livery stable continued under Thomas's primary management, with Patrick as the senior partner, and Thomas had married in '87, a quiet woman from a farm north of town named Ellen who got along well with Ada in the comfortable way of women who appreciate each other's competence. Ada's bookkeeping practice grew with the town's commercial development, and she had taken on 2 apprentices by '88, young women from the area who wanted to learn the trade, and whom Ada taught with the thoroughness and encouragement that her father had given her, believing, as he had, that knowing a thing fully was always better than knowing it partially. Their 3rd child arrived in '89, another boy they named James for Ada's brother, who had himself come to visit the previous spring during a railroad layover, and had approved of everything about Patrick after a single afternoon spent in the pasture talking horses, which Patrick had noted with private amusement as one of the more efficient character assessments he had encountered. James was born in the spring with the kind of ease that suggests a family has found its rhythm, and Patrick held his 2nd son with the same careful stillness he had brought to holding Henry and Margaret, and told him about the horses, because it was the thing he knew best and the thing that connected him most directly to the life he had built. Henry, by now 7 years old, was deeply interested in the horses and spent most of his free hours in the pasture or the stable, which delighted Patrick and sometimes alarmed Ada, who had the practical woman's awareness that horses were large and unpredictable, and children were small and enthusiastic, a combination that required supervision. Patrick supervised with the patience of someone who understands both horses and children and knows that the best thing you can do for either is give them room to learn, while being present enough to catch them when they fall. Margaret, at 3, was already showing the particular combination of her mother's directness and her father's capacity for quiet that would serve her excellently her entire life. She had opinions about everything and expressed them with considerable precision for a person of her age, and Patrick found this so consistently funny that Ada sometimes suspected he was encouraging it, which he was, because there was something about watching his daughter deploy her grandmother Ada's clarity of thought in the context of a 3-year-old's concerns that delighted him more than almost anything. The century turned, though that was still years away, and the life they had built would carry them toward it and past it. But the shape of it was already clear, already real, already the closed and settled thing that Patrick had believed he was no longer capable of building when Ada Atwood had ridden into Caldwell on a windy day in April of '82 with her hat and her carpetbag and her accounting skills and her particular way of looking at things. On an evening in 1889, 7 years into the life they had made, Patrick was in the barn with Chester, running his hands along the horse's neck in the absent-minded way of a man who is thinking, while doing something comforting and familiar. Chester was 10 now, the rangy young foal of the boarding-house stable long since grown into the mature and excellent animal Patrick had always believed he would be. Ada came out to the barn with a lantern, the children asleep in the house, the evening cool and quiet around them. "You have been out here an hour," she said. "Thinking," he said. She hung the lantern on the hook and came to stand beside him, leaning against Chester's stall in the easy way she had around horses now, the city woman who had become someone the horses recognized and trusted. "About what?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, but it was not the old closed quiet. It was the quiet of a man who is gathering what he wants to say. "I have been thinking about what my life looked like before you got here," he said. "I was running this place and not feeling much of anything. I had decided that was all right, that it was sustainable." He paused. "I was wrong about that. I just did not know I was wrong yet." Ada looked at him in the lantern light. "Patrick, I was thinking about how close I came to just staying like that," he said. "If you had not brought that coffee. If you had just walked by, I think I would have just kept going in that direction indefinitely." A pause. "That is a strange thing to think about," Ada said. "I thought about the same thing once. About 6 months after I arrived, when I was beginning to understand what was happening between us and what it might mean." She looked at her hands and then at him. "I was frightened, actually, for a little while, because I had decided after my father died and everything in St. Louis changed, that I could manage on my own and that was sufficient. And then here was this man who looked at a horse with more tenderness than most people look at people, and who fixed a gutter without being asked, and who said one honest thing to me on a street in June, and I realized I was no longer managing on my own and had not been for some time." "Were you glad?" he asked. He asked it in the way of a man who knows the answer but wants to hear it said. "Terrified," she said, "and completely, profoundly glad." He looked at her across the small, warm space of the barn, with the lantern light on her face, and the sound of the horses around them, and the night outside the open barn door, and he thought of everything that had come from a cup of coffee on a cold April morning, and thought that the mathematics of small kindnesses was more astonishing than any other arithmetic he had ever done. He crossed the space between them and kissed her, which he had done thousands of times now, and which still had in it something of the quality of that first time, the recognition of someone who has been found rather than stumbled upon. Chester made a soft sound of patient disapproval at being ignored. Ada laughed against Patrick's shoulder. Patrick laughed too, and it was easy and natural and entirely his, the laugh that had come back to him like something he had not known he had lost until it returned. They walked back to the house together across the night yard with the stars above them, and the lights of Caldwell visible at the far end of the road, and the sound of their children sleeping inside. And the life they had built enclosed them like the valley holds a river, shaped around them and holding them together, complete and real and full of everything that mattered. Patrick Atkins, who had not spoken a kind word in 2 years and had learned to stop reaching, and had decided the cost of things was too high, had been undone by a cup of coffee and a simple acknowledgement, and had forgotten to stop, and the forgetting had been the making of him. Ada Atwood, who had come west looking for a fresh start, and had found one in the most unexpected and specific of places, a livery stable and a fence rail, and a man learning how to open back up, had built her life in Kansas with her whole self, as her father had always told her she should build things. Henry grew up to run the horse operation with his father's eye and his mother's numbers. Margaret became a teacher in the Caldwell schoolhouse at 19, which Ada cried about at the kitchen table with the specific emotion of a woman watching her child carry forward something that was carried forward to her. James grew up with horses in his blood and became a veterinarian, the only one in 3 counties, which was both useful and a source of considerable satisfaction to everyone in the family. The house north of town stood for many decades. The pasture was good, and the water from the creek was reliable, and the prairie sky above it was the best sky in the world, which Ada had maintained from the beginning and never changed her view on. And Patrick, standing beside her at the fence on any given evening watching the light go across the Kansas grass, had never once in all the years thought she was wrong. This was what had become of the man who did not speak and the woman who thanked him for something small. This was the life built from a small act of noticing, from a coat placed over a cold horse, and a cup of coffee carried around a corner, and 3 words offered simply because they were true. It was, in the end, not a small life at all. It was the fullest kind, built from the ground up by 2 people who had both lost enough to know exactly what they were holding when they held it, and who had decided, each in their own way, not to let it go. The stars came out over the Kansas prairie on a warm September evening in 1889, and Patrick and Ada stood at the fence of their land and watched the last of the light burn off the horizon, and the horses moved in the dark grass behind them, and somewhere in the house Henry was reading, and Margaret was drawing at the kitchen table, and James was sleeping the deep sleep of the very young with his fists curled, and his future enormous in front of him. Ada leaned her head on Patrick's shoulder and Patrick's arm came around her, and the prairie held its particular evening quiet, vast and still and full of everything. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the thing itself.